All right, today we're diving into a document that is, well, it's really one of a kind. I mean, imagine this. You've got a philosophical manifesto arguing for a total, radical reshaping of humanity, but it's also the official campaign literature for a guy running for US Congress. Yeah, you heard that right. That's exactly what we're looking at today.
So here it is. This is the cover of Favored Races by a man named James Hart. And at first glance, you see that classic image of human evolution, right? But take a closer look. See how some of the figures are actually walking backwards? That one little detail perfectly captures the author's whole fear, that humanity isn't moving forward at all. He thinks we're actually regressing.
And the book doesn't hide its purpose. I mean, it says it right there on the cover page. It's an argument for why humanity desperately needs a eugenics program, a system for controlling human breeding to get more desirable traits. And it's also a guide to all the things he thinks are standing in the way of that goal.
But here's the kicker. This wasn't just some fringe manifesto you'd find buried in a library somewhere. No, the author, James Hart, used this book as official campaign literature when he ran for Congress in Tennessee. It even had instructions on how to send money to his campaign. Wild, right?
Okay, so let's dig into that first because it's so unusual. How does this thing actually work as a manifesto for Congress? The author is completely open about it. He's not trying to hide anything. He presents this thing as a philosophical book, sure, but also as his official campaign literature and a direct way to raise funds. For him, there's absolutely no separation between his radical philosophy and his political goals. They're the exact same thing.
And if you had any doubt, this quote just seals the deal. This is the official disclaimer that the Federal Election Commission requires, and it's printed right there in the book. It leaves zero doubt that this manifesto was a fully baked part of a real political campaign. So what exactly was the problem that the author thought was so urgent it needed a congressional campaign funded by a eugenics manifesto? Well, in his eyes, it was nothing less than the degeneration of the entire human species.
The author's whole argument kicks off with this massive claim. He says that our core institutions, political, religious, have completely ignored the laws of evolution. And the result? He warns that we are literally on a path of degenerating back into a subhuman state. He even comes up with a name for this process, dysgenics. He defines it as the anti-evolution of humanity. And he points the finger at one specific cause, social welfare. From his point of view, supporting the incapable just ensures their genes get passed on, and he believes that weakens the entire species. So, in the author's world, things like modern compassion and social safety nets, they aren't our strengths, they're fatal flaws. He actually argues we're practicing a kind of eugenics in reverse, where we're actively selecting what he calls inferior traits for survival and basically guaranteeing the downfall of civilization.
Okay, so if society is supposedly causing its own decay, what's his big fix? Well, he proposes a complete teardown and rebuild of our moral framework, something he calls evolutionary ethics.
And in this system, our whole understanding of right and wrong gets flipped on its head. Morality is no longer about compassion or individual rights. Nope. Good is simply whatever improves the human gene pool. And evil, that's anything that weakens it. Simple as that. And to illustrate his ethics, the author uses this really provocative comparison. He contrasts the whole political debate around aborted fetuses with what he calls the retarded ward. He's arguing that the real tragedy isn't abortion, but allowing a child with severe genetic defects to be born, who he claims could have been spared suffering through what he calls a eugenic abortion. And this is where he tries to completely reframe the whole idea of eugenics. He presents this position not as cruel, but as the ultimate act of compassion, the highest expression of concern and love for the children of the future. He's arguing it's our moral duty to protect the well-being of future generations this way. Now, with a framework like that, you might think you know exactly who the author is going to blame for all this societal decay. But his target, it's actually pretty surprising. The author just straight up rejects blaming the common targets you might hear about. He says the real enemy isn't any one group of people. Instead, he argues it's the very foundation of Western society itself, the political and religious institutions that his supposed conservative allies are trying so desperately to protect. And this quote just captures his contempt perfectly. He sees a foundational principle like all men are created equal, not as some timeless truth, but as a dangerous, outdated myth. He suggests that clinging to it is like trying to drive an 18th century carriage to the moon. It's just actively holding back human evolution.
So if the enemy is society itself and the solution is eugenics, where does this all end up? What's the ultimate endgame here? Well, the author's answer is nothing short of humanity becoming God. He starts by posing this question, and it's meant to completely reframe how we think about divinity. He asks, what if God isn't some creator from the past, but is actually an evolutionary destination in our future? And that question leads to his central and pretty staggering assertion: man is not a creation of God. Man is God, just in the process of becoming. Our ultimate evolutionary destiny, he argues, is to become the very being we've always worshipped. And so everything we've looked at, the run for Congress, the attack on social welfare, the redefinition of good and evil, it was all building to this final declaration, a political document that ends by looking the reader in the eye and saying, "You are God." It's just a stark reminder of how truly radical ideas can pop up in the most unexpected of places.